High above the Swiss town of Interlaken, the Saxetenbach river cuts its way down from the mountains through a narrow gorge carved into the rock over thousands of years. For much of the summer, its cold, clear water made it an irresistible playground for a growing adventure sport known as canyoning. But the river had another side. When heavy rain fell across the mountains above, water poured from the surrounding slopes and converged in the gorge, gathering mud, rocks, and fallen trees as it travelled. Within minutes, the clear mountain stream became something altogether different, sending a sudden, violent surge tearing through the narrow passage below. It happened here every year. They called it the wave. And on the afternoon of the 27th of July 1999, 53 people were making their way into the gorge. By the late 1990s, Interlaken had become one of the adventure capitals of Europe. Set between the lakes Thun and Brienz, and surrounded by some of the most spectacular mountain scenery in Switzerland, they came to climb, raft, paraglide, and throw themselves from bridges on the end of a cord. For young backpackers travelling through Europe, Interlaken offered the chance to do something they might never have considered doing at home. And one of the fastest growing attractions was canyoning. Part climbing, part swimming, and part scrambling, canyoning involved following a mountain stream through the natural landscape. Participants slid down smooth rock chutes, jumped into deep pools, squeezed behind waterfalls, and where necessary, abseiled down sheer drops. It had masses of appeal. A good guide provided the knowledge, the ropes, and the equipment, allowing someone with no previous experience to spend an afternoon doing something that felt genuinely wild. Few companies understood that appeal better than Adventure World. Founded in Interlaken in 1992 by Georg Herdler, Peter Balmer, and Stephen Friedli, Adventure World began by offering bungee jumping before expanding into other outdoor pursuits. When the company decided to add canyoning to its growing list of activities, it brought in two experienced New Zealand guides, Dave Erickson and Jeff Clark, to help establish the operation. Together, Erickson and Clark explored the Saxetenbach, working out a route through the gorge and installing the bolts and safety lines needed to take paying clients through it. They had also helped write the company's original safety and evacuation procedures. The response was extraordinary. Within their first season, canyoning had become so popular that Adventure World was running 3 trips a day, and the company grew rapidly. Before long, dozens of guides were taking thousands of visitors through the surrounding mountains. But behind the success, some of the people who had helped build Adventure World's canyoning operation were becoming increasingly uneasy. By the summer of 1995, Dave Erickson had begun to notice how much things had changed. Adventure World was sometimes handling as many as 500 clients in a single day, and as the numbers increased, there were no longer enough experienced guides to meet the demand. And, before the season was over, he resigned. I could see something bad was going to happen, he later recalled, and I didn't want to be part of it. The following year, after being assured that more experienced guides would be hired and better equipment provided, he agreed to return. But it would be his final summer with the company. Jeff Clark remained with Adventure World for another 2 summers. He later said that he had stayed partly because the money was good, but also because he hoped he might be able to reverse what was happening. Instead, he watched experienced guides gradually disappear, while newer, cheaper recruits took their place. With so many trips being booked, he also remembered increasing pressure to go ahead even when the weather was questionable. Eventually, Clark reached much the same conclusion as Erickson. Alan Burt, another experienced guide, believed the problem went deeper than simply employing less experienced staff. After 5 years with the company, he had watched its culture change as the operation became larger and more successful. There was a macho attitude in the company, he later said, an attitude that slowly turned into arrogance, which is very dangerous when you're taking people's lives into your own hands every day. Bert also described what he called the lowering loop syndrome. Experienced guides had originally trained the newcomers, but as those veterans left, people with only 2 or 3 years of experience began training the next generation. Eventually, guides with barely a year or 2 behind them were teaching others. By the summer of 1999, Bert said 7 of the 8 guides on the day of the disaster were in their first season. Georg Herdler would later claim that across all of its activities they had carried more than 100,000 clients, with a broken leg being the worst injury any of them had suffered. It was an enviable safety record. But then came Tuesday the 27th of July, 1999. Among the visitors in Interlaken that day was a large group of young travellers making their way through Europe with Contiki Travel Company. Canyoning wasn't part of their organised tour, but while they were in Switzerland they were offered the chance to try it as an optional excursion through Adventure World. Some had never heard of canyoning before. Among them were New Zealand couple John Rowe and Kelly Swanson Rowe, who had been married for 3 years. Kelly had reservations about the canyoning trip and tried to persuade John that they shouldn't go. After arguing about it for much of the day, John eventually agreed that if Kelly could get their money back, they would give it a miss. But unfortunately they were told no refunds, and so Kelly relented and they went ahead with the trip. Australian Tiffany Johnson signed up too. Like many of the others, she had little idea what canyoning actually involved until it was explained to her. She didn't feel there was anything unusually dangerous about it. They were given wetsuits, helmets, life jackets, and the rest of the equipment they would need, before being divided into groups for the journey to the Gorge. Rachel O'Brien remembered the preparations rather differently. To her, everything felt rushed. Clients moved through the base collecting clothing and equipment, and when Rachel was handed a pair of shoes that didn't fit properly, there was no time to exchange them. There was something else Rachel noticed. The weather was changing. A forecast issued that day had warned of localized thunderstorms, and by the time the canyoning groups were preparing to leave, dark clouds were gathering over the mountains. Rachel would later say that even before they left base, it was apparent that a storm was approaching. And elsewhere in Interlaken, another canyoning operator had already reached the same conclusion. Heinz Loosely had been running adventure trips in Interlaken for more than a decade, but he cancelled his afternoon excursion after he decided conditions were no longer safe. At Adventure World, the decision went the other way. Shortly after 4 o'clock, senior guide Benny Steury and operations manager Benny Gaffner headed out to assess the conditions. Adventure World had cancelled trips because of high water in the past, but on this occasion, Steury and Gaffner gave the waiting groups permission to proceed. At around 4:30, the first of 4 groups entered the river. Leading the way were 10 clients, accompanied by guides Mike Abbott and Karin Müller. Among them was Kelly Brajkovic, a young Australian travelling through Europe with 2 of her cousins. The remaining groups followed at intervals over the next 45 minutes, until 45 clients and 8 Adventure World guides were making their way down the river. As they descended, the landscape around them changed constantly. In places, the river ran between wooded banks, while elsewhere it squeezed between great slabs of rock, tumbled over waterfalls, or collected in deep pools before continuing downstream. Much of the route was relatively open. The sides were steep and difficult in places, but there were points where someone caught by rising water at least had a chance of scrambling up the bank and away from the river. Roughly halfway through the descent, however, the character of the Saxetenbach changed. For about 100 metres, the gorge closed in. The river disappeared between steep rock walls, creating the only true canyon section of the route. Once a group had entered, the only practical route out was along the river itself. Under normal conditions, it was simply another part of the adventure. In a flash flood, it became a trap. And while the 4 groups continued making their way through those changing sections, the weather above them was deteriorating. Rain was falling as the later groups approached the gorge, while thunder and lightning could be seen and heard over the mountains. The fourth and final group had barely begun its descent when somebody else tried to stop them. Martin Seematter was a volunteer firefighter from a village farther up the valley. He had seen the thunderstorm developing higher in the mountains and understood what heavy rain there could mean for the river below. As the group prepared to enter, Seematter approached them and warned them that a severe storm was underway upstream. They should not go into the gorge. But the guides replied that they knew what they were doing and continued with the last group as planned. For those already farther downstream, however, there was little indication of what was gathering above them. The water was cold but beautifully clear. Tiffany Johnson would remember the gorge as almost impossibly beautiful, and for those making their way through it, the experience was exhilarating. They jumped from rocks into deep pools of mountain water, slid down smooth stone chutes polished by the river, and squeezed their way behind waterfalls before following their guides on to the next obstacle. Each bend seemed to bring something different. For people who had known little or nothing about canyoning, it was easy to understand why the sport had become so popular. There was excitement in not quite knowing what waited around the next bend, and just enough fear to make reaching the other side of each obstacle feel like an achievement. For a while, it was everything they had paid for. By chance, the 4 Adventure World groups were now spread across very different parts of the Saxetenbach. The first group had already passed through the enclosed section and reached the more open lower third of the route, while the fourth and final group was still in the upper third and had yet to reach it. Groups 2 and 3 were directly inside those 100 metres of narrow gorge. Then began the first signs of trouble. The clear mountain water began to cloud, turning brown as the levels steadily rose. Rachel O'Brien noticed it happening as her group continued downstream, and by the time they had completed their first abseil, she later estimated that the river had risen by about half a metre. Ahead of them, the first group had reached one of the more difficult obstacles on the route, a section the Adventure World guides called the Fridge. To cross it, clients had to lower themselves into freezing water beside a boulder until little more than their head remained above the surface, then pull themselves behind a pounding waterfall and across to the other side. Kelly Brajkovic volunteered to go first. Karen Muller crossed ahead of her, while Mike Abbott remained behind to help Kelly into position. But the water repeatedly pushed Kelly beneath the surface. She tried 4 times before Abbott finally pulled her out and helped her onto the bank, where she collapsed, struggling to catch her breath. By now, the river was rising faster and carrying increasing amounts of mud and debris. Then, at around 5:40 that afternoon, Mike Abbott saw what was coming. "Get out of the water!" Kelly looked upstream. Racing towards them was a wall of thick brown water around 2 metres high, churning with logs, rocks and debris. Within seconds it was upon them. Karin Muller turned back towards the fridge. Nigel Mitchell was still in the water, directly in the path of the flood. She went in after him, managed to drag him clear, and the group scrambled desperately up the bank as the torrent thundered through below them. Then people began appearing in the water. Kelly watched helplessly as 4 or 5 members of the group behind them were swept past, with such force that nobody on the bank could safely reach them. Mike Abbott and another guide ran downstream, hoping that an eddy farther along the river might catch anyone who had survived the initial surge. Scrambling down the muddy bank, they found 3 people trapped in the swirling water, barely conscious. All 3 were pulled out alive. Back at the fridge, Karin Muller could see more people being carried towards her in the torrent, and despite the violence of the water, she went back in. She managed to reach another person and bring them to safety, then turned towards the river again. Each attempt meant putting herself directly into the same current that was sweeping people helplessly through the gorge. She went in again, and another life was saved. Then, seeing yet another person being carried towards her, Karin entered the water for a 4th time. On this occasion, the current caught her before she could make it back to the bank. The 30-year-old guide, who had already saved several lives, was swept away with the flood. Farther up the gorge, Rachel O'Brien and the others in her group had no idea what had happened at the fridge. They only knew that the river around them was becoming increasingly difficult to stand against. Alongside Rachel was her best friend, Kylie Morrow. The two young Australians had entered the canyon together that afternoon. By the time they reached their fourth jump, the water had risen so high that the group had gathered together, holding hands to steady one another against the current. Then, from somewhere towards the back, 19-year-old Brianna Smith saw something coming. She shouted a warning. A wave was coming down the gorge. Everyone turned, and Rachel saw what she would later describe as a wall of water as high as the gorge itself, bearing down on them. The guides shouted for everyone to grab hold of whatever they could. Rachel estimated they had perhaps 2 seconds before it reached them. The wave struck before most of them had time to move. Rachel lost her grip on the rope and was pulled into the torrent. Somehow she managed to reach a rock and haul herself far enough out of the current to escape with cuts and bruises. Others around her disappeared downstream. A little farther along the gorge, Australian backpacker Tiffany Johnson was facing the same rapidly rising water. Only minutes earlier she had watched it turn from clear to muddy brown and rise from her ankles to her knees within seconds. Her guide began urging the group to move more quickly, and Tiffany approached the next jump as the river continued to swell around them. She jumped into the pool below, where a guide was waiting in the water to help her. As Tiffany surfaced, he reached towards her, and she stretched out her hand, but their fingers slipped past one another, and the current immediately dragged her away. There was no possibility of swimming against the torrent, and Tiffany realized that remaining where she was might eventually kill her. So she made an extraordinary decision. She let go. Then she was thrown out of the water onto the top of a waterfall. But there was nothing she could do to stop herself going over it. When Tiffany managed to raise her head above the water, she saw people from her group being carried past her, face down in the torrent. She believed they were already dead. She reached the bank and grabbed handfuls of grass, trying to pull herself out, but the wet ground simply came away in her hands. Then another survivor reached down and pulled her onto the bank. Moments later, the guide who had tried to catch her after the jump appeared. He had survived too, and together they began making their way towards safety. Elsewhere in the gorge were New Zealand couple Kelly Swanson-Rowe and her husband John. They had entered the gorge together, but had been split into separate groups during the descent, with John farther along the river ahead of his wife. Kelly heard the flood before she saw it. Above the noise of the river came what she later described as a massive rumbling sound. She turned and looked upstream and saw the wall of water coming straight towards them. There was nowhere to run. As the torrent swept through the gorge, Kelly managed to grab hold of a log and clung to it while the water tore past her. Somewhere ahead was John, and through the chaos, Kelly saw her husband being swept away. There was nothing she could do to reach him. Kelly herself remained trapped in the water, holding on as the flood continued around her. She would later estimate that she was there for around 10 minutes before one of the guides finally managed to reach her and pull her clear. Once out of the water, Kelly began making her way along the side of the gorge, desperately searching the swirling grey river below. But John had disappeared downstream. Within minutes, the violence that had filled the gorge began to subside, leaving survivors scattered along the river, injured, exhausted, and struggling to understand what had happened. As people began emerging from different parts of the canyon, the scale of what had happened slowly became apparent. Friends who had entered the Saxetenbach together were now searching for one another, while guides tried to establish who had made it out and who were still missing. Some survivors had been pulled from the water far from the point where the flood had first caught them. Others remained stranded along the banks, bruised and shaken, but alive. There was no way of knowing how far the missing had been carried. The wave had passed through the gorge in a matter of minutes, but the river continued flowing beneath them. Anyone who had not managed to escape the torrent might now be somewhere far beyond the section of canyon where the groups had been caught. The emergency response was beginning, but this was no longer simply a rescue from the river. The search would have to follow the water further out. From the gorge, the Saxetenbach continued downhill, eventually feeding into the Lütschine river system and towards Lake Brienz. By the following day, rescue groups had entered the water, and the true, terrifying violence of what had unfolded inside the gorge became impossible to ignore. The victims hadn't simply been carried downstream. They had been trapped inside a monstrous torrent of churning rocks, branches, and razor-sharp debris. Driven relentlessly against the jagged walls of the canyon and thrown over massive waterfalls, some were eventually found miles away from where they had first entered the water. The physical toll was devastating. Many of the bodies recovered bore horrific injuries. For those faced with identifying the dead, the nightmare only deepened. Kelly Swanson Rowe was among those who helped, a task made agonizingly difficult by the black wetsuits the victims were wearing and the lack of anything immediately identifying them. John was among the very last bodies she saw. The trauma to his body was so severe that Kelly struggled to recognize the man she had been married to for 3 years. But it wasn't just the physical changes that broke her heart. It was the overwhelming, haunting realization that while she was looking at John's body, the person she loved was completely gone. In all, 21 people had died. 18 were clients of Adventure World, 3 were guides. Among the Australian victims were newlyweds Alyssa and Scott Brooker, who had been travelling through Europe on their honeymoon. Scott's body was eventually recovered. Alyssa has never been found. For those who survived, however, another question was beginning to emerge. How had a 2-hour adventure through a professionally guided canyon ended with 21 people dead? In the immediate aftermath, there seemed to be an obvious explanation. The group had been caught by a freak flash flood. Adventure World co-founder Georg Herdler described it as completely unpredictable, comparing what had happened to a sudden rockfall. There was even speculation that the thunderstorm had created a temporary dam somewhere high above the gorge. Fallen trees and debris, it was suggested, had blocked the Saxetenbach until the obstruction suddenly gave way, releasing the wall of water without warning. If that were true, those responsible for the canyoning trip could scarcely have known what was coming. But as Swiss police began investigating the disaster, that explanation quickly started to unravel. Within a month, investigators had rejected the theory of a temporary dam. More troubling was what investigators discovered about the river. The sudden surge was not an unknown phenomenon. Waves of this kind occurred in the Saxetenbach every year. People familiar with the gorge knew about them, and investigators also began looking closely at what had happened within Adventure World itself. The concerns raised years earlier by Dave Erickson and Jeff Clark suddenly carried a very different weight. So did Alan Burt's description of increasingly inexperienced guides being used as the company expanded. Of the 8 Adventure World guides who entered the canyon that afternoon, 7 were reportedly in their first season. That did not mean those guides were responsible for what happened. 3 of them had died alongside their clients. The larger question was whether they should ever have been placed in that position. Attention increasingly turned towards those responsible for running the operation, the training they provided, and the procedures they had established, and, most importantly, the decision to allow the excursion to begin. Adventure World had taken tens of thousands of people through the Saxetenbach without a catastrophe. But the very success that had once supported the company's confidence now raised an uncomfortable question. Had years of getting away with it gradually made the danger easy to dismiss? The investigation would continue for more than 2 years. Then, in December 2001, 8 members of Adventure World appeared before a court in Interlaken, charged with manslaughter through culpable negligence. One guide had testified that the rain would make the water higher and the canyoning more interesting. On the 11th of December, the court delivered its verdict. 6 of the 8 defendants were convicted of manslaughter through culpable negligence. Among them were Adventure World's 3 directors, together with senior members of the operation responsible for managing the canyoning program. 2 of the guides were acquitted after the court concluded they had not held the authority to cancel the excursion. The sentences were comparatively short. Those convicted received suspended prison terms and fines, and for some of the families who had travelled halfway around the world, that was difficult to accept. But the verdict itself mattered. The court had rejected the argument that what happened was an unforeseeable natural catastrophe. The storm had presented a foreseeable danger. For Bill Peel, whose son Billy had been killed, that distinction was important. He rejected any suggestion that what had happened had simply been an act of God. His son's body had eventually been found in 65 metres of water, his oversized wetsuit filled with sand. God had not sold Billy a ticket, he said. People had. The convictions did not bring Adventure World's story to an end. 10 months after the disaster, the company was involved in another fatal accident. In May 2000, 22-year-old American Matthew Coleman was taking part in one of its bungee jumping excursions when he was attached to a rope intended for a much higher jump. He struck the ground and was killed instantly. Adventure World subsequently ceased operating. Together, the 2 accidents intensified questions being asked across Switzerland about an adventure tourism industry that had grown enormously during the 1990s, often faster than the rules governing it. In the years that followed, greater emphasis was placed on recognised qualifications, independent safety standards, and formal assessment of the risks involved in commercial adventure activities. Eventually, Swiss legislation introduced licensing requirements for companies and guides offering certain high-risk pursuits, including canyoning. But none of those changes could alter what had happened that day. For the survivors, leaving Switzerland did not necessarily mean leaving the gorge behind. Kelly Swanson Rowe returned home without John. In the months after the disaster, grief affected her in a way she found difficult even to explain. For around 4 months, she said that she seemed to lose the ability to see colour. Everything around her appeared grey. Years later, when another canyoning tragedy appeared on television, Kelly found herself unable to look away. The images were painfully similar. "It's just déjà vu," she said. "It's what happened to us." Tiffany Johnson carried her own memories home to Australia. She suffered nightmares and flashbacks, sometimes seeing, hearing or feeling the water again without warning. There was survivor guilt too, and eventually she sought professional help to deal with what she had experienced. Life continued for those who survived, but so did the consequences of those few minutes in the Saxetenbach. Today, memorials near the gorge remember the 21 people who lost their lives. 5 flags represent the countries they came from, while photographs, flowers and messages left by families and friends give names and faces to those who never returned. Among them is Alyssa Brooker, whose body was never found. At the memorial, beneath her daughter's photograph, Alyssa's mother left a message. "Still hoping we'll find you." Now, in my humble opinion, this tragedy is a classic example where success in a company eventually led to the degradation of standards and safety, all borne by a great deal of arrogance. Despite the nature of the tragedy, I hope you appreciated the way the information was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.